Born in Anaconda, June 22nd, 1953. I'm married to Kay Eccleston. We have 2 children, Eric and Kelsey. They're both married and have their own families. One lives in Ohio, the other in California. My mom and dad were both born in Anaconda. Both children of immigrant parents. My father's parents came from Sweden. My mother's father came from Lettermore in Ireland. My grandmother was also 100% Irish, although her parents came from Boston. And interestingly enough, I've never been able to find a birth certificate for my grandmother, so I don't know if she was born in Boston or born in Deer Lodge County.
Okay. And your grandfather was from Ireland originally, is that what you said?
Yes. He emigrated apparently when he was relatively young, in his teens at some point in time. Somewhere, it was after the turn of the century, so somewhere in maybe the 1910s, 19-teens. He came from Lettermore, County Galway. It's an area that's now a designated Gaeltacht, and English was his second language. So he actually spoke Irish with his brothers here in Anaconda. My mom was always interested in learning a little snippet here and there of Irish, but when we were kids, she tried to teach us things like our prayers in Irish, and we would have nothing to do with it.
Did your grandmother, or your mother, excuse me, did she grow up around a lot of Irish then being spoken around in the household?
Her father spoke Irish to the kids, and he would speak Irish to his brothers and the folks that came from the general area in Ireland where he was from. But the story in family was always that when the wives were around, they didn't speak much Irish. It was kind of their secret language.
That's funny. And your grandfather, did he immigrate with his brothers here to Montana?
The story that we were always told was that they came from a relatively large family. Mm-hmm. The father was a boatman. We don't know if that meant he owned his own boat, but it would have been very small. Mm-hmm. And they came from, at that time, a very poor area, and it was kind of a subsistence living. So he wasn't, there really was not enough work to support the number of boys in the family. So as soon as the kids were old enough, 14, 15, then they started making arrangements to join. Their mother's sister had immigrated to the United States, and she was the sponsor of all the children. One of his brothers died in Ireland in a drowning accident near the home, and another sister died very, very young as a child, but all of the other siblings in the family emigrated to the United States, and only one ever returned.
Well, do you know if your grandfather went back to visit at all, or did he never?
He never did. And actually, my grandfather was born somewhere close to a year before I was born. And he did have a younger brother, Coleman, and Coleman was at least 10 years younger than my grandfather, but we always looked to Coley as our surrogate grandfather. And it was kind of an interesting situation because my grandmother, Mary, and Michael Donahue were married here. Mary's younger sister, Julia, lived with them because her mother was a widow and she didn't get along with the stepfather. And then when Coleman came over, Michael's younger brother, Julia and Coleman were married. So my mom always talked about the fact that the 2 Donahue families were double cousins. So the 2 brothers married 2 sisters. So Coley adopted us. He treated us as grandchildren, and we looked to him as a grandfather.
Okay. When they moved, they came over to I guess it would be your grandfather's mother's sister.
Yes.
Where was she living at the time in the U.S., do you know?
It was a small town in Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, and I have the name of it written down somewhere. It was Braddock, Pennsylvania. It was a very small enclave, and it was really interesting because an awful lot of people from the Lettermore area immigrated because they knew of friends or relatives that were working there, and then some of them ventured out to Montana when, perhaps when times were tight at the steel mills, and found work on the smelter, and so then they just kind of gradually came out here by word of mouth. But it was very interesting in that the area my grandfather was born is a very remote, sparsely populated, kind of a very close-knit little community, and then it was almost like they immigrated their entire community, first to Pennsylvania and then out to Montana. And it's interesting that if you ask someone from Dublin or a big city, what's the best way to get out to Lettermore? And they would say, who goes? It's just so far flung. And you would hear the same thing if you say we're in Chicago and say, well, do you know the way to Anaconda, Montana? It's like, well, why would you want to go all the way out there? It's interesting that they both ended up or both communities kind of were in the same situation geographically.
And you think that kind of just a natural trend from the possibly like the steel mill in Pennsylvania to come out here and then work for the smelter here in Anaconda?
Yeah, it is kind of logical, but I think it had more to do with the fact that members of the community had emigrated and found work, and I think the work was incidental. They'd all been small holding agricultural folks or fishermen, but I think it was more trying to stay with the people that they were familiar with, their community, the communities kind of emigrated, as it were.
Where did your grandfather meet your grandmother?
He met my grandmother in Anaconda, because as I said, we're pretty certain my grandmother was born in Deer Lodge County. Her family lived on the outskirts of Anaconda, not in the city proper. I'm not exactly sure how or where they met, but Anaconda in those days was, it wasn't segregated as far as ethnicity goes, but there were lots of pockets of ethnic groups, and it was kind of unusual to socialize or marry outside those ethnic groups. So her father was an Irishman from Kerry, and so I don't know if my grandfather knew of him on the smelter and met his daughter. We really don't know. They talked very little about those types of things. And on the other hand, too, usually you only get interested in asking those questions after the people you should have asked are long gone.
Right. Did you any stories that you heard from your parents about your grandfather working here in Anaconda?
Yeah, some kind of those really interesting. Well, we thought interesting. Every family thinks they're interesting little tidbits. My grandfather really liked dogs, and he had like a border collie. And the border collie went everywhere with him. And in addition to working on the smelter, he also had a couple of odd jobs around town. One of which was, I think the technical term is, he was the swamper at the Owl Bar, which means that after the bar closed, he would sweep the floors and clean up. And so he took the dog with him all the time. And my dad in particular used to tell the stories about Mike and his dog, and the fact that the dog was treated like a person at the Owl Bar. They actually had a bar stool that the dog sat on, and the bartender was just as fond of the dog as my grandfather was, and if someone was sitting in the bar stool and the dog came into the bar, the barman would ask the patron to get off the bar stool and let the dog sit on the bar stool.
Oh, wow. So your grandfather was at a bar. What did he have any other jobs? Did he work at the smelter? Or?
He did work at the smelter, but I'm not exactly sure what the capacity was. I'm not really sure. And unfortunately, like I said, you always think of the things you should have asked. The only person who would have known died last June, and it's just one of those things. Was my mother's brother, and he'd share a few things, but he was about as closed mouth as the stories I heard about my grandfather. They came from a very a very rural area that was really economically deprived. And my adopted grandfather, Coleman Donahue, the few things that he would say about it is people would ask him if he ever wanted to go back, and he'd always say, why on earth would I ever go back there? And if he was asked to describe it, all he would say is it was a terrible, rocky place. And the first time that I went there, I mean, I thought the landscape was beautiful, but it is a lot of limestone rock. You know, a lot of the fields were built up because they supplemented them with they carried in seaweed and all kinds of other things to make the ground better. But it is very sparse, a very sparse and spare landscape.
When did you go visit
Ireland? I've gone to Ireland twice. I want to say that I'm not positive, but I think the first time we went was in 1999 or 2000. And then when my daughter graduated, she did her PhD work in the UK. And so when she graduated, we went back again, met our son, and we visited with Kelsey in Scotland, and then we spent a week in Ireland. And we went out to the area where my grandfather was from both times.
How was visiting where your grandfather was from?
Actually, it was really interesting. One thing about coming from a really small community like Anaconda is it's always surprising when you go someplace, like to the big city, and you hear so many times that somebody ran into somebody who knew somebody from Butte, or ran into, they were in someplace in New York City or Chicago or something. And we had a really interesting experience like that. My grandfather had one sister who emigrated, married a gentleman. I want to say that the husband's name was Smith, but I'm not positive. But he died, and she returned to Ireland. And all we ever knew after we started getting interested in asking questions about whatever happened to her, well, she went back to Ireland and she married a man named Kelly. So I was like, there are a lot of Kellys in Ireland, I'm sure. And so the second time we went to Ireland, we stayed at an Irish-speaking B&B very near where my grandfather was from. And, the woman just was very friendly, and she wanted to know, why on earth did you come all the way out here? And so we told her. And she said, and what was the family name? And I said, Donahue. And she said, let me make a phone call. So she made a few phone calls, and we met a woman named Kate Donahue, who was kind of a distant cousin. And she said, well, what do you know? And I said, well, basically they all emigrated to the United States, but we do know that a sister came back, a sister named Margaret, and she married a man named Kelly. And she said, oh, let me make a phone call. So she took us out to this young man's house. His name was Kelly, but I don't know if it was his father or grandfather had a little bachelor room there. He was actually the nephew of the man that this aunt had married.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the really interesting thing is my uncle Coley. Should we stop?
Oh no, it's okay. Or yeah, if you want, that's
okay.
Fine. You're fine. That's great.
Okay.
Great piece of documentary footage right there. The same thing happened at Celine's.
Oh, okay.
It was awesome. The husband peeked in from the side and was like, oh.
So are we live again?
Yes.
Yeah,
oh, okay.
You're fine.
I kind of lost my train of thought.
Oh, that's right.
Oh.
You know what? Actually, sorry. While we're paused, or pseudo paused, I'm gonna move just a touch, and I may move you guys a bit.
Sure.
Just accounting for.
Okay. Oh, and I probably should have asked that sooner. Is it best if I have the conversation with Meg?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, don't worry about me.
Okay. So we went out and met this gentleman, and his name was Petey Kelly. And it was really interesting because my great uncle Coley smoked like a chimney. And we went out to visit Petey Kelly, and we were taken into his little bachelor room, and the man sat in the chair and chain smoked the whole time. But it was very interesting that my uncle Coley had a pretty thick accent. I was very used to it. My husband Carl, on the other hand, there were many times when he would say, "What did he say?" And Petey Kelly's speech patterns were so much like Coley's. And Coley had a couple of expressions. And one thing that he would always like point his finger at you and say, oh, now I have you, now I have you. And so Petey Kelly said, so tell me who your people were, et cetera, et cetera. So I told him about this aunt and the brothers, and all of a sudden he started wagging his finger at me and said, oh, now I have you, now I have you. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that just something like a little phrase like that was something that was kind of a remnant that of a speech pattern or something that he grew up with. And so that was just... I just thought that was really special.
Yeah. What kind of like childhood memories could you tell me about here?
It's one of those things that, looking back and looking at the way things are now, we were really blessed to grow up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else. I went to parochial schools, first grade through high school. At that point in time in Anaconda, the population in Anaconda was large enough that it supported 3 parochial schools, and I'm not sure how many public schools. And there were always kids in the neighborhoods. I mean, no one ever, if you had to stay inside, you were either sick or you were being punished. Everyone, there were just tons of kids down on the school playgrounds. It was really nice to be able to go out, just walk out to Washoe Park. My sisters and cousins and I would go out to Washoe Park and spend the entire day. We always knew when to go home because when the smelter whistle blew at 4 o'clock, you knew that supper was about to begin. So that was kind of our alarm clock. If you walk through Anaconda now, the population is much lower, mostly because of the loss of industry, and naturally, there are not the number of large families that there were when I was growing up, in the late 50s and early 60s. But it's so rare now to see packs of kids playing outside. So that's one thing that I think is something that is remarkable about my childhood. It's what used to be normal, and that's not so much anymore.
So, justification, what exactly is a parochial school?
A Catholic grade school.
Grade
yeah,
school. Okay.
We had the majority of the teachers were nuns, although we had some lay teachers, and the high school as well. There was an order of nuns that taught at the high school. Some of the teachers were priests, and there were some lay teachers as well.
Do you have any kind of distinct memories of going to Catholic school at all, or was it just kind of normal?
We thought it was normal.
Yeah.
Other people might not think so. It was really interesting in that the schools, rather than say having all the primary school or primary grades 1st through 3rd or 1st through 5th in one school, and then a junior high, all of the parochial schools in town were 1st grade through 8th grade. So it was very much a kind of a family-oriented pecking order almost. The 8th graders were the lower grades looked to the 8th graders as kind of the adults of the school. It was Anaconda, as I said, Anaconda had a really large population. The nuns had absolutely no difficulty as far as discipline went in the classroom, and on the other hand, though, it wasn't unusual to have 45 to 50 kids in a single classroom. I can't imagine anyone attempting to teach a grade school class of that size anymore. But it was very interesting. So our teachers, rather than being, Mrs. Caney or Mrs. McCarthy, were Sister Anselm and Sister Everhard. And then when I was in 7th grade, probably 6th and 7th grade, the nuns all got to change their names. They all got to take back their real names instead of their nun names. So we left 7th grade and with one set of nuns and came back, and suddenly there was a Sister Jessica. Who's Sister Jessica? No one knew Sister Jessica. And that was her real name and not her... I'm not sure. They probably had a name for it, but I can't remember their order name or whatever it was.
So When exactly? It was in the 80s, right, that the smelter closed?
It was. I want to say that the smelter closed the announcement came in 1980. Okay. On my mother's birthday. She took it particularly personal.
What do you remember about that time? Was that something that stuck out for you?
Yeah, it's people kind of look back on those historic dates, and it's always, where were you when Kennedy was assassinated or whatnot. I know where I was when Kennedy was assassinated. I was standing on the sidewalk along with all the other grade school kids from St. Paul's School, because we were lining the streets because the parish priest had died. So we were all kind of attending Father Schulte's funeral on the day that Kennedy was assassinated.
Wow.
Yeah. But the day the smelter, in fact, even in the interviews I've conducted with people that are, considerably older than I am, that's, that it's just something that for Anaconda was a very devastating time. Most people just thought, it's just another scare tactic. And probably 2 years later they were thinking, we just have to wait a little while. It'll open up again. It'll open up again. So it caused a lot of changes in Anaconda, because after the first year, then people who had young families to support, they had to go elsewhere for work. So it was almost like that kind of history repeating itself. Our parents came from Ireland because of tough economic times, and then we kind of found ourselves in the same situation. Anaconda, like Ireland, was a place where our largest export was our young people, young families. Carl and I were fortunate enough in being able to stay. Carl didn't work for the Anaconda Company, and so just kind of by luck of the draw, we got to stay. A lot of our friends had to leave. Anyway, people go out after college or high school for the bright lights in the big city, or just a change of pace, or they're interested in something. But particularly Anaconda and Butte, I know that the people that were born there, it's always, I wish my kids could have the childhood I did, or they seem to have particularly fond memories of the area. And one thing that was kind of interesting is probably 5 or 6 years after the smelter closed, a lot of homes were for sale and times were still kind of tight. But it was interesting in that people who had grown up here, who were like early retirees, started moving back. And so that was kind of interesting, kind of a little mini renaissance.
Interesting. Do you think your closing changed or made your kids' childhood much different from yours? What kind of impact do you think that had?
I don't think so, because like I said, we still had a small town. They still had the same kinds of circles of friends that I did when I was growing up. They were, because as I said, much smaller families, so their circles of friends were much smaller. But we were fortunate enough that our livelihoods weren't dependent on the smelter, and we were able to, we had a modest house, kind of a modest lifestyle, and so I don't think that my children's childhood was that much different. It was a smaller scale, maybe.
Okay. To me earlier in our pre-interview that you're a member of the Ladies AOH.
I am.
Could you explain that for me just a little bit? What kind of that entails and stuff, being a member?
The Ladies Ancient Order of Hibernians is started out as an auxiliary to the men's organization, the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Before that happened, they were actually a group called the Daughters of Erin, and they functioned primarily to serve as kind of a social network for young single women who emigrated from Ireland. They actually kind of, in some cases, sponsored, they would be women who came from families who might have had relatives that they were sponsoring as far as the immigration process goes. Just kind of a social network, kind of a family away from the family that they left. I'm not exactly, and that's just stuff I've been told. I'm not exactly sure then when, you know, kind of coming under the umbrella of the Ancient Order of Hibernians happened. And then before I joined the organization, which was, I've been a member a very long time. I joined like in 1977. My mother talked me into it. I was a little resistant, but at that point in time, they were a separate entity. They had kind of not broken away from the AOH, but rather than being a ladies' auxiliary, they became their own entity. And it's primarily I guess you would call it a service club now. You know, much like the Kiwanis or something like that. We do a lot of interesting projects. We have a quilt project every year. All of the ladies in the group donate squares for a quilt, and then we have a sewing committee that puts it together, and then we sell all kinds of raffle tickets on it, and on St. Patrick's Day we raffle off the quilt, and the proceeds go to a community entity. One year it was, you know, we've donated several times to the Washoe Theater because it's such a treasure for Anaconda. You know, they were at one year, I think they lost their heating system. We've donated to Special Olympics, the Hearst Free Library. We just pick some local group or project or entity that needs a boost that year, and the past 3 years we've raised nearly $3,000 for these groups. So I guess now we are truly a service organization, but it's also, we also join it for the fellowship and the social aspect. You know, we have a Mother's Day dinner and a Christmas dinner and picnics throughout the year, and at the end of breakfast, then everyone in the room has to stand up and introduce themselves. And if you have a party piece, you have to do your party piece. So if you're the person who always has a good joke, you have to tell a joke. Or if you're the person who always sings a particular song, you have to sing the song. And unfortunately, though, over the years, we're to the point where, you know, some of those favorites have started to, you know, they're elderly people, and they've started to pass from among us. So it's almost kind of a wistful thing. It's like, you know, remember on St. Patrick's Day when Sadie Murphy used to always do such and such, and you know, Sadie's no longer with us. Her daughter's still a member, but it's. I don't want to say that, you know, we think we're better than Butte. We think that our St. Patrick's Day is a little bit maybe more traditional. We don't have as much of the spring break aura that some St. Patrick's Day celebrations take on. Not that some of that doesn't go on, but it's really fun. We also, I think someone was talking about it last week. We also formed a drill team, the Irish Washerwomen Brigade. And one year it was really, really interesting in that we had a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter as far as our membership went. So I'm not exactly sure what our median age is, but at certain points in time we've had 75-year-old washerwomen marching with the drill team. So it's really kind of fun. So it's and you know, we have traditions that go with everything associated with the regalia for the parade, because the Irish washerwoman is kind of the archetype of, you know, an Irish woman who was able to take care of herself and her family. You know, some people think that, you know, the Irish washerwoman is kind of, oh, that's kind of paddywhackery. It's kind of a joke. You know, the number of young Irish women, married and unmarried, who worked as domestics in the United States and helped raise families. You know, back in the 1800s and the 1900s and the early teens, it's you know, long before there was you know, equality in the job market between male and female. You know, our mothers were always working mothers. My mother always worked. So that wasn't something that instantly happened sometime in the 80s or 90s as a new trend. I think people who come from working class backgrounds know that you have to do what you have to do, and so I think it's an honor to working women. But we also have a lot of fun too.
I'm sure.